This is a walkthrough of setting up ViaQ common logging based on the instructions on GitHub. I have used a machine that has been provisioned on Beaker. I'm going to check it to make sure that it's got everything set up correctly. It has a host name, it has an FQDN, it has an IP address that is accessible externally. It has forward hostname resolution. And it has reversed hostname resolution. So that appears to be working correctly. I'm going to use root to run Ansible. Now I need to check the SSH configuration. I need to create a key pair for root so that Ansible can use SSH as the root user. OpenShift Ansible does do SSH into the local machine from the local machine, so that needs to be working. So there's my key pair that I've created for root. Now I want to add the host keys so that SSH in Ansible doesn't ask me if I want to trust the IP address. I also need to add the root public key to the authorized keys, so it will allow passwordless SSH. First I'm going to generate the host key for localhost so that I can SSH into the host name named localhost. And I'm also going to generate a host key for the host name returned by the hostname command. So there's my key, public and private key, my authorized keys file, my known hosts file. So now I can do passwordless SSH using root to the local host. And there's my key in the hosts file. I'm using root, so I don't need to worry about passwordless sudo. The Beaker machine is set up with all the ports. The next step is to set up the ViaQ Yum repository. So on the README, there's a link to the Yum repo, so I'll just grab that link from GitHub. I'm on CentOS, so I'm on the correct platform, CentOS release 7.3. So I'll just use curl to grab that file and write it into the correct place in the Yum repositories directory. So I need to install those packages for OpenShift Ansible. I'm also going to check and make sure I've got Git on the machine in case I need it. And I also need the patch command. So I've got those commands. Everything looks good. So now I will install OpenShift Ansible using Yum. And there it goes. So now the Ansible packages are finished. They are installed on the system. The next thing I need to do is patch Ansible. There's unfortunately a bug in the 1.5 packages upstream of OpenShift Ansible that has not made it into the released RPMs yet. So I'll go to the OpenShift Ansible directory under user share Ansible OpenShift Ansible. There's my directories that were checked out. I'll use curl to grab the patch file from the ViaQ site. There's the patch file. Now I'll just use patch. And there it is. You can see it patched those two files. The next thing I need to do is I need to grab my Ansible inventory and environment files. The environment file is called vars.yaml.template, and the inventory file depends on the platform, but I'm going to download it to a file called Ansible inventory. So I'll just copy and paste the curl commands out of the web page. There's my vars.yaml.template. There's my Ansible inventory file. So there's a few variables. Vars.yaml.template is intended to be edited. The inventory file is intended not to be edited, but you can certainly edit either file if you want to, but you shouldn't have to. And there's the Ansible parameters and the logging parameters. The next thing we need to do is check to make sure the Ansible can read our environment correctly. So we're going to see if it resolves the host name. And yes, it resolved the host name. That's the same host name that we were using previously. So that Ansible fact gathering is working for the host name. Let's check the IP address. So Ansible is also able to get the correct IP address through its fact gathering. Just to make sure, let's do a reverse lookup on the IP address, and it does resolve to the correct host name. One more, just check to make sure that the IP address is the external one, that it uses that route to get to the outside, and that is the correct one. So Ansible is working correctly. It's able to gather the correct facts. This web page also has documentation about those parameters in the vars.yaml.template file. There's also documentation in the form of comments in that file as well. Since this is a beaker machine and everything is set up already, we shouldn't have to edit anything. It should just work, because the Ansible facts that we expect to be working are indeed working correctly. So let's copy our vars.yaml.template file to vars.yaml. We're not going to change it, so we can just use it as is. And now let's run Ansible. So we can copy and paste a lot of the stuff out of the web page. We need to specify the path for vars.yaml in the inventory file. And we're going to use the playbooks bio config.yaml as our playbook. And we'll redirect the output in case there's an error. We need to go back. And so the Ansible takes a while. It's finally gotten to the point where it's installing the logging components. You can see it's Elasticsearch, FluentD. And now we're getting to the end of the Ansible install. It's just doing the various things that it does at the very end of Ansible install. And now it's done. Ansible installation is complete. So the next thing we need to do is we need to check the logging components to see if they're running. So we're on project logging. And there are the components. So as you can see, some of them are still creating. Some of them are not actually running yet. Ansible install doesn't make sure that all the components are running, so it may take a few minutes. This is a fairly low-powered machine, so it's CPU and RAM bound, so it's going to take a while for it to be able to deploy all of these components. So you can see that there's a deploy pod that's running, that's responsible for actually deploying the real pod. If we do logs -f on the deploy pod, once it completes, OC logs -f will exit and the pod should be running. But let's just take a look. So this gives it a good opportunity to show some of the troubleshooting that we can do. One good command is OC describe pod. And this just gives us some basic information about the pod. But the last thing is the events. And this can be very useful. So we can see that 1 minute ago, there was an event that said it was pulling the image. So it's still apparently pulling the image from Docker Hub and or uploading it into OpenShift or whatever it does. We can also use Docker images to see what images are available on the system. So we can see we have Curator, FluentD, and Elasticsearch image. We don't have the Kibana image yet. So that's why Kibana is probably still in the container creating state. So we've waited a little while, and now let's check and see. So Curator reports that it's in an error state. So Curator will eventually give up and restart if it can't connect to Elasticsearch. So let's see if that's what's going on. We can't get the logs. Logs doesn't report anything. So let's just kill that, and let's just use describe to look at the pod. All right, so describe. So, oh, we can see 2 seconds ago it started container. So it must have just restarted it because it couldn't connect to Elasticsearch the last time it tried. We can see that the image is there. And we also have the Kibana image as well. All right, so let's look at the rods. Okay, so now it is. So now the status is reported as running. So Curator's okay. Let's take a look at the Curator logs now. Okay, so that's normal. There's no indices, which is fine when it first starts up. You may see this error message. That's not a problem. Let's look at the FluentD logs. That's taking, let's stop that. Now let's take a look at the Elasticsearch logs. Make sure Elasticsearch, okay, so this looks okay. So this is the normal startup stuff that we see. We see cluster health change from red to green. We see indices being created, mappings, etc. So that looks okay. Let's try the FluentD pod log again. Okay, so we see that it did at some point have trouble connecting to Elasticsearch, but it does keep retrying. And you can see down at the bottom that it did retry, and the retry eventually succeeded. So that's good. That's what we expect to see. Okay, so we see Kibana is still in the container creating state. We don't need to wait for Kibana. We can just go ahead and set up Mux. We can just let Kibana finish. So let's download the script from the ViaQ site. Oh, we need to make sure it's executable. So for the Mux host, we're just going to use Mux and then a dot and then whatever the host name is. At this point, for demo purposes, it doesn't really matter. But it will actually have to be a real host that's available in DNS or whatever host lookup you're using. All right, so the Mux script is running. Everything looks fine. And at the end of the script, we can see that it generated our CA certificate and shared key. So if we look at the deploy, we can see that it's deploying Mux now. If we follow the log, we can see that it's scaling, waiting, and success. So now there should be a Mux pod running, and there is. Let's take a look at the log for Mux. Looks fine. So there should be a service for it, and there's the service, and it's listening to the external IP address, which is the external IP address of the machine. If we do a netstat -nlt and look for that port, we see that there is something listening to that port. If we use sclient connect to talk to that port, we can see that it makes a connection, and it's got some sort of garbage down there. That's fine because it's a non-HTTP protocol, so we can't really, it's binary. Another thing we can try is we can try a search of Elasticsearch just to make sure that Elasticsearch is working and we have data in Elasticsearch. So let's get the pod name for Elasticsearch, and then we'll use ocexec with curl, and that's also described in the ViaQ README. So we can see that we have logs coming in to Elasticsearch, and this looks like it's a log from Mux itself when we started up Mux. The setup Mux script will usually generate the CA certificate and shared key, and there they are in the directory. If you need to regenerate them, there's instructions on the README about how to do that. The next step is that we want to be able to test Kibana. So we need to create a user that we can use to log into Kibana. So we'll create a user called admin with a password admin. And we'll assign that user the cluster admin role so that that user can see all of our operations and project indices. In order to test Kibana, we need to have a host name. So the host name that gets used by default is just Kibana dot and then whatever the host name that we installed on. So I'm using my local workstation. I'm going to create an entry in the host file for the machine itself. I don't really need to do this, but there's already a DNS entry for it, but just in case. So I'll create an alias for that machine called Kibana.machine name. And then I'll also create one for Mux. And I'll test Mux for my local machine as well. So there's my host alias. So I'm going to just create I'm going to use a profile in Firefox called AOS to hold my certs and keys and passwords and things like that. So we go to Kibana, we get this usual error because I did not install the CA certificate. I could have installed the CA certificate and I could get around that, but okay, so we log in as admin. Kibana is loading. And there's the discovery page. So I can see I have logs starting about 15 minutes ago. I have my indices available, my fields, so it looks like everything Kibana is working. The final thing I want to do is test that I can hit Mux from an external machine. So I'll just use OpenSSL S-Client again, and this time I'll use the host name that I configured. And there it is. I see the handshake garbage from the protocol, which means everything works.